If the past few years were about testing and developing 5G technology, this year is the time to quit lip service and show some real applications. Chinese tech giant Huawei, on the one hand, is ready to launch its first 5G foldable phone and go head-to-head with Samsung, and on the other, is busy with its 5G deployment globally amid mixed attitudes and responses. Clearly, the 5G race is heating up and entering a critical period. To discuss the latest development and future direction of 5G technology and its application, I'm happy to be joined in the studio here in Beijing by Andy Mock, a non-resident fellow at Center for China and Globalization, and via satellite, I'm going to talk to Fraser Cameron in Brussels, the director of the EU Asia Center, and also Professor Benjamin Zhao, a network expert at Paris School of Business in Hong Kong. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to our studio discussion here, Andy. From day one of the trade disputes between Washington and Beijing, everybody is talking about 5G and Huawei. It seems Huawei has really become a business card of China's digital technology. Now, what's special about Huawei, and what does that mean globally for the United States in particular?
Well, I think this is the nightmare scenario for the United States in that 5G and AI, and we're focusing on 5G today, really is what's called a general purpose technology that is as important as the discovery of fire, as the discovery of electricity. So it is, I think it's difficult to underestimate the impact of 5G, and I think this is why the U.S. is so concerned about this.
Let me go to Fraser Cameron, who's standing by in Brussels. The Chinese are in the mood of celebrating the end of our Chinese Lunar New Year festival by talking about a launching ceremony of 5G technology in Hong Kong, Shanghai. First of all, yet another major event, Fraser, that makes the Chinese respect Britain even further. That is, the British authorities, after a serious review of the 5G technology from Huawei, come to the conclusion that they are able to mitigate the risks from the 5G network of Huawei. Do you share their relief, their relief about the feeling or the opinion itself?
Well, I think it's a pretty complicated situation. First, as Andy was saying, it's a bit of a nightmare scenario for the United States, and the United States has been lobbying European and other governments around the world not to use Huawei technology. The Brits have obviously come to a different conclusion, that any security risks can be controlled or mitigated, and therefore they have gone along a different path. And I think it's quite possible that other European countries will take that view as well. I mean, there are many different aspects to this issue. There are competition aspects, technological aspects. There's a overall concern about the rise of China in the United States. So I think all these factors play into a very difficult decision just now, but one that is of critical importance for the future of the world economy.
One follow-up question, Fraser, is a few years ago when Prime Minister David Cameron received Mr. Ren Zhengfei in number 10 of Downing Street, Huawei was ironically barred by the American lawmakers and politicians. Why there's such a big difference between London and Washington regarding Huawei?
Well, the British authorities say that they have actually put Huawei technology through the processing plant at their intelligence headquarters, GCHQ, and think that there is no real security threat. So if the Brits can do this, one asks the question, why can't the Americans do this or other people do this?
If I can jump in for a second here.
First of all, let me go to Benjamin, who's standing by in Hong Kong. Benjamin, an expert of digital technology, why the Americans have shown so grave concerns with the so-called backdoor bugging, if any, implied in the software or the tele-infrastructure of Huawei?
Well, in fact, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China denied the U.S. accusation about this kind of spying and backdoors design. And the ministry, in fact, restated the complaints of many other countries about the U.S. Espionage and eavesdropping of their country president. So there's clearly some double standard issue here, and let us recall what the U.S. has done on other areas in human rights pollution as well as cybersecurity.
An expert of digital technology, I don't think you should be a spokesperson of the foreign ministry. I expect you to dwell upon the technical software itself. Do you think it's an easy job for Huawei to install any virus, any backdoor? Technically, let's look at the technical implications.
Well, in fact, it is not easy to do so, and in fact it would harm Huawei's long-term commercial interests. In fact, the vice president of Huawei recently stated that it might be the fact that not using the Huawei's equipment will prevent the U.S. from installing or eavesdropping other allies' communication.
What do you think of Huawei's strength of having a strong army of lawyers to defend the stakes of Huawei globally?
Well, I think as a top multinational company, Huawei clearly has at its disposal the best legal talent in the world, whether that's in-house or whether that's outside counsel. So I think that's not in question. But I think the real issue here is that we can't escape the politics, because even if we look at it structurally, the person that ultimately will decide whether the case will move forward is President Trump. So I think that that is the crux of the issue. So clearly Huawei has to address the legal mechanics, the mechanisms. That is a procedure that has to be followed through on. But I think how this will be resolved, at least in part, will be political.
Let's go back to the news event itself that brought us here in the studio and through satellite to discuss Huawei and the 5G. We are seeing more and more real-life applications for 5G technology, such as the 5G digital indoor system at Shanghai Hongqiao Railway Station and the 4K video streaming of the Spring Festival Gala on the 5G network. What convenience can these deployments bring to the masses, and where are we in the development of 5G technology, Andy?
Well, I think as you opened this program, Yang Rui, that this is the year 2019 when it goes from really about talking and planning to actual execution. But I think what's important to point out for our audience, though, is that for consumers, for most people that are not in the industry, what they're looking at is the 10% that's like the tip of the iceberg. That's faster download speed, so you can download a high-definition movie in seconds. All of these applications that offer faster download speeds to consumers is kind of sexy, but I think what's really important is the 90% underwater that people don't see. And what 5G is enabling is billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of devices to talk to each other. And that will change every industry, whether we're talking about transportation in driverless cars, healthcare and telemedicine, urban management with smart cities, a lot of things we probably don't even know yet, but most experts in the field say that the real breakthroughs will be in what they call Industry 4.0.
Fraser, given the importance of 5G globally, where do you think Huawei positions itself? Definitely, it faces very tough competitions from around the world. Other than the role that Huawei has played for the past few years and its deployment of the global tele infrastructure, what are the other competitors that may be hired and employed and used by European economies and indeed by Washington to seriously compete with Huawei?
Well, the two biggest ones in Europe are Sweden's Ericsson and Finland's Nokia, but they themselves admit a couple of years behind. The problem is that European regulators have not really seen the urgency of moving on to 5G quickly, and at the moment they haven't even launched in many cases auctions for the spectrums, and so they're looking at it primarily as a tax revenue issue rather than a future technologically orientated issue. And I think that's a fundamental problem in Europe and perhaps in other countries as well, that we're not trying to look and see what the opportunities are, as Andy explained, in terms of all the various applications that one can use this technology for. So Europe's behind, trying to work out a position under pressure from the United States, but determined that they should not be moving along just on one track. They want to ensure that there are different operators involved here. I think the last thing in Europe is that we want to make this a monopoly operation.
Let's probe this issue further a little bit. Fraser, while a big majority of the Chinese consumers, I mean netizens in their millions, feel so comfortable with the online payment and e-commerce, we are already talking about AI, artificial intelligence, and 5G. In Hongqiao railway station, we're going to execute the digital technology. Why do Europeans trail behind? I mean, is it because of their protection of the privacy? I mean, why are you guys so concerned with the big data?
Privacy is a big issue. You remember the huge uproar when the NSA was caught out spying on Angela Merkel's phone just a few years ago. I mean, data goes back, obviously, to the authoritarian regimes that Germany had, both in the post-war and pre-war. And also, history plays a role in Germany and other countries. They saw what happened in terms of the banking system. They tend to use cash more. They seem to sort of prefer using cash, the older generation, essentially. So I think it will take some time to bring about the full technological revolution in Europe, partly because of the historical aspects and partly because of the concerns about data privacy.
Thank you so much. You're watching Dialogue with Andy Mogg, Fraser Cameron, and Benjamin Zhao. We're discussing the deployment of 5G technology as well as its global implications. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Gentlemen, Benjamin, question for you. 5G foldable phones are expected to take over 2019. Mobile phone manufacturers, including Huawei, Samsung, OnePlus and LG, either confirmed or hinted at the launch of 5G foldable phones this year. Benjamin, which one of the two features, 5G and being foldable, will appeal more to consumers?
Well, I think 5G will definitely shock users in terms of speed at selected sites, because it is still far from being implemented outdoor with extremely high speed everywhere, given the need to really overhaul existing network structure. So even 4G can deliver 4K or television streaming, but we are only able to have about 20 megabits during the daytime. So it is really not the bandwidth, it's about the network structure behind. That is the bottleneck. In that sense, foldable phones are there 24 hours a day after you bought it, so you'll be impressed if you need a bigger screen that is portable.
Andy, a follow-up question about this is, why do so many people argue that 5G phones have the potential to radically alter how smartphones are used every day? What else can 5G phones offer in addition to increase the speed of the internet?
Well, there's two issues. So one is faster speed, meaning faster download speeds, but there's another kind of speed.
When you talk about
you know, people are talking 10x to 100 times as fast. So much, much faster.
Amazing, absolutely unbelievable.
Exactly. And the benchmark a lot of people will say is that you can download a high-definition movie in seconds. So that's maybe a more intuitive way to understand how much faster it is. But something else that's very important that's related to speed is what's called latency, which just means how quickly it takes your device to react. And that also will allow maybe not so much in terms of as we think about smartphones, but it will enable a lot of other applications. So we talked about driverless cars, telemedicine, so where reaction time is very fast. It's not just how quickly can you move data over the air to your device, but how quickly it can react. But before we move on, Young Ray, I'd like to go back to a point that Fraser made about why Europe is having a hard time keeping up with this.
That has kept the Chinese puzzled
Yeah.
about why Europe, which is known for technological breakthroughs, agrees to trail behind China. I mean, this seems to be their consensus.
Yes. Well, I think Fraser makes a great point about norms around privacy. But there's, I think, another important issue as well, that Europe, while EU is a very large market, but it's also very fragmented. And one of the big challenges for 5G is that it will take a lot of investment, as Benjamin said. So we want citywide, countrywide 5G coverage. We have to invest, or the telcos have to invest in a lot of new towers, which is quite expensive. So the issue here is that Europe in particular, the cost of capital for many of the telcos is actually below their return on investment, essentially meaning they're losing money. So where are they going to come up with the money for this? And this is why companies like Huawei are so important, because Huawei is the most cost-competitive supplier of the networking equipment. So let's put aside the phones, but because without the networking equipment, as Benjamin said, you're not going to have 5G, even if you have a 5G phone. So Huawei is the cost leader, and I think this is why countries like the UK, which is a very, very practical country. It was Lord Palmerston that said the UK has no eternal enemies, no perpetual friends, but only its interests are eternal. So I think every country has to look out for its own citizens, its own companies. So Huawei being so cost-effective and the equipment being so reliable makes it really an irresistible choice for countries all around the world.
Fraser, with the Brexit negotiations well underway, do you think this event will deliver a negative impact upon the prospects of having European Union together, setting up their own standard about 5G? How do you assess the consequences about the Brexit?
Well, Brexit is a classic lose-lose situation all round. I think that Andy's quite right in terms of the high costs involved in setting up the networks here, and one should also add that Huawei has somewhere between 20 and 25% of all patents regarding 5G, so it's in a very strong starting position. And the EU itself is slowly wakening up to this now, and as Andy said, it's got a huge market, 500 million rich consumers. So the important point is to see firstly what the mistakes have been made in the last few years, and it's not always so bad to be a little bit behind the curve, because you can sometimes learn from mistakes and jump on to the next stage. If you look at many parts of Africa, they never had landlines, and they've moved on to mobile technology and saved themselves a lot of money. So I think Europe is certainly behind at the moment, but recognizes the issue and is moving quite fast to plug the gaps. Brexit, I think, is not really going to play a huge role in this.
Benjamin,
Yes.
bad news is global smartphone sales growth stagnated recently. Good news is both Huawei and Samsung have scheduled to release their first 5G foldable smartphones in a few days. Now, question, what do you think are the key factors that consumers consider when comparing different 5G phones?
I think the cost of data plans will be crucial, as important as the technology. And there is always a switching cost. So the earlier a producer enters the 5G era, the more loyal the customers will become as they familiarize themselves on the new features. But perhaps given the low cost of imitation, software vendors are much more silent than hardware vendors on the 5G plans. I will be more convinced only after a killer app emerged that must rely on foldable phones.
Andy, what might fuel the sense of crisis on the American side regarding Huawei might be, other than in addition to the withdrawal from the TPP, politicians in Asia are talking about the launch of a RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Does that mean we're going to incorporate the idea of a BRI into interconnectivity, or what we call the community of shared future, by using Huawei's digital technology? Would that be even the worst case scenario when you look at the nightmare?
I think that is the core of it, because we can't separate technology from economics, from geopolitics. And I think what the U.S. sees that its dominance rests on technology. So when it sees a company like Huawei leading, I think it finds it very, very threatening. And what is unfortunate, I think, is that it's a strategy that it's very difficult to see a path to success for the U.S. I mean, it's here waving what it thinks is a big stick of dynamite to try to slow down Huawei. But I think the reality is it's really just a limp, soggy firecracker, in that it's very difficult to stop, like we see with Thailand, the Philippines, now have adopted or testing Huawei 5G. 30 other countries have signed on. The UK might not be far behind. So I think that from the US's perspective, it is very concerned, alarmed, and I think the technological prowess as well as the cost competitiveness of Huawei truly make it, I think, well positioned to lead in the 5G world.
Let me go back to Fraser. I mean, 5G technology does not stand alone. Let's go back to what happened a few years ago when the AIIB was about to be established. The lawmakers in the DC tried very hard to boycott the idea of AIIB, but it's the United Kingdom that was the first among other members of G7 to support AIIB, and that has caused very positive reactions, if not chain reactions, from other major European economies. Germany, Italy, France follow suit and join AIIB very quickly. So the idea of boycotting AIIB from Washington collapsed totally. This time around, do you think the UK will play a similar role? The question, however, is, Fraser, how do you assess the importance of the Chinese market in the age of a global chain or supply chain? Is it an easy job to decouple the Chinese economy? Fundamentally, lawmakers and politicians in the DC are talking about the same idea of whether they will eventually make it, decoupling, delinking the Chinese economy. 5G might be a testing stone, a touchstone, right?
Yeah, I think we're past that now. I mean, it's really impossible to decouple the US and Chinese economies and the European and Chinese economies. We're so interlinked, and global supply chains are what they are, and governments can, point fingers and try and introduce tariffs to sort of change the way the game is played. But fundamentally, I think these three economies, the US, the European and Chinese or East Asian economies, are so interlinked now, it would be a disaster to try and uncouple them. So I think we have to try and work out what are the rules of the game. I think we have to proceed, as we saw with AIIB, on trying to set out standards, rules, which the AIIB have accepted, which are by and large Western standards. And I think, if we can achieve further consensus on reform of the WTO, for example, and there's various international telecom negotiations ongoing just now, it should be a roughly level playing field. Obviously not perfect, the one in which all the operators that we've been talking about can get a fair crack at the market, and I think that's going to be important going forward. So the attempt to boycott and isolate China is simply not going to work.
And President Trump, among all other options to support the idea of unilateralism and protectionism, is to warn Chinese students against entering areas of high technology. Will that help the brain drain? I mean, this is a very critical concept about who will win tomorrow.
Yeah, well, I think it's absolutely true, Yang Rui, because when we talk about Silicon Valley, there's a joke in the Valley that Silicon Valley was built on the IC, not the integrated circuit, but Indians and Chinese, meaning the role of foreigners, in particular Indian and Chinese, have played in the supremacy, the technological supremacy of Silicon Valley is undeniable. And we see now drop-offs in application rates from foreign students, not just from China, going to the U.S. because of concerns about the change in tone, some of the changes in policy where it makes it a less welcoming place. So I think on the one hand, the U.S. talks about the importance of maintaining technological superiority, but yet some of its policies, some of the way it's approaching these issues is actually, I think, undercutting it. And I think it makes it, again, difficult to see what is the path to victory for the U.S. here.
We don't want to enhance the pessimistic sentiments about the zero-sum game. I do show great interest in the point that Fraser addressed a few minutes ago about the reform of WTO. Do you think this is a solution to the geopolitical rivalry and similarly geo-economic competition between the two biggest economies when it comes to the importance of 5G? Do you think by reforming the WTO, leveling the playing field, the two sides could come to terms?
Well, I think the reality of the world is it is not a bilateral relationship. I mean, there is the EU, there is Southeast Asia, there's Africa. So especially places like Africa, like Southeast Asia, growing very rapidly, young populations will be some of the fastest, I think, adopters of 5G. So when we look at that, what is the best platform and the way to resolve these problems in a constructive manner? I think it really has to be through a multilateral approach, whether that's the WTO, other regional type organizations. That really is the only way forward.
Thank you so much. Whether we're going to usher in an era where we have the more inclusive world order, geopolitical or geoeconomic, largely depends on the universal use of 5G, and the competitions between Washington and Beijing will somehow navigate a course that will say a lot about what the future might hold. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.